The Finance Committee is set to meet tomorrow here on Parliament Hill to begin a series of meetings focused on the We Charity controversy. Back in June, the feds decided to award a sole-sourced contract to the charity to administer a $900 million program that was intended to match students with volunteer roles and compensate them. But last week, we learned the Prime Minister's mother and brother have together been paid nearly $300,000 by We for speaking engagements, which led to an apology from the Prime Minister. On Monday, he said he should have recused himself from cabinet discussions about the awarding of the contract. One Liberal MP had questions, though, as soon as that contract was announced. Nathaniel Erskine Smith is an Ontario Liberal MP. He joins us from Toronto to discuss. Hi, Mr. Erskine Smith. Good to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I have a couple of things I want to ask you about decriminalization, because it's a subject we've spoken about before on the show. But first, also the We controversy involving the summer service grant program for students. And in particular, I wanted to get your thoughts on the program itself, because my understanding, based on an article in The Star, is that actually before all the stuff with the We Charity specifically and the Prime Minister came to light, you had initial concerns just about the program being outsourced, period. Can you expand on that for me? What was your initial reaction when this program was announced?
My initial reaction is that the civil service could likely pursue this and fulfill the needs of this program. And particularly if we have a website that matches service organizations with volunteers. The service organizations, knowing the ones we have here locally in Beaches, East York, but the strong service organizations across this country, they are well placed to intake volunteers, train volunteers, and deploy volunteers. And so I thought we could have utilized many more organizations across the country in a more serious way.
So my understanding is that you reached out to the minister in charge of this, Minister Chagger, who's also been on the show. She made the point in various press conferences as well as on the program that this was the recommendation of the public service. Is that what she told you as well?
That's what her office advised me as well. And they obviously have more information than I have. And so that was interesting to hear. And I think an important point to make. Still skeptical that this was the only organization that was able to deliver on this program. And maybe we just had different views of what this program was meant to be. I viewed this program as getting students into organizations that really needed the volunteer support. And I think the view in using We was treating this more as a youth service corps and training and empowering the students themselves. And there is a place for that, I think. But in the course of a pandemic where we need boots on the ground very quickly, I think using existing organizations, maybe even MP offices, as we do with Canada Summer Jobs, but making sure we use existing connections and meaningful connections would have made a lot of sense.
I've heard from a lot of bureaucrats who have reached out saying that they are too skeptical of the idea that the public service would have put forth the view to cabinet that only one option is available to them, that only this organization could administer that type of program. Do you share in those, do you believe that that's what the public service did?
Honestly, I have no idea, having not been a civil servant, as in comparison to the guests that you've had on before, the people you've spoken to. I take the minister's office at their word, and if they say that ESTC made this recommendation, I trust in that. I will say that it really depends upon the view that one has of this program, and the frustration right now from some of the service organizations that have reached out to me is this program is on pause and they want to see it continue because they have volunteer opportunities for students that are meaningful and that would really help our country.
What do you think of the setup of the program? Because some service organizations have also criticized, for example, that you're paying less than minimum wage along with the administration. Like you, I've heard from many of them who say we could have been part of administering this.
I think this program was developed at a particular moment in time where it was completely unclear that there were going to be any real opportunities and meaningful work opportunities for students this summer. And that's why we have the Canada Emergency Student Benefit. It's also why this program was first announced. Knowing what we know now, as the situation has been fluid and changed, I think it would have made a lot more sense to flow these same dollars through Canada Summer Jobs. And there are organizations that have reached out to me to say we could still hire people at $15 an hour. Certainly businesses are contacting me to say we could hire people at $15 an hour if we had that support from the government through Canada Summer Jobs, if there were additional dollars in the system. So there are all sorts of different ways this program, I think, could have been improved. But let's also keep in mind, these are programs that were being developed, designed, and ultimately deployed in a pandemic. And it was a very fluid situation, and programs that would ordinarily have taken months or years were being put together in a matter of weeks.
Since the initial announcement and around the program and sort of the concerns that you're voicing have been voiced, there's an additional layer to it, an ethical layer around the organization itself, the Prime Minister's ties to it, and in specifically the fact that they paid his mother and brother. That's information that wasn't out until last week. How does that, or did that, I should say, change your reaction to this?
Changed it insofar as I was concerned that the Prime Minister was too close to it, and I was very happy to see, one, that the decision was ultimately reversed and quite quickly, and two, that the Prime Minister apologized and stood in front of Canadians and said he should have recused himself, and I think that was the right thing to do.
Do you think it ends there?
Well, obviously, we have an ethics commissioner that is going to continue his investigation and see if there's anything more that would warrant public criticism. But we've seen significant public criticism over these last number of weeks and warranted. And I do think it ought to end there in some respects. I mean, the Conservatives have oddly called for a criminal investigation, which is obviously an incredible overreach and completely disproportionate and not in keeping with the facts as we know them. And I think an apology is important. I think a recognition that what happened here shouldn't have happened is important. And I think ultimately the rules of our Conflict of Interest Act are designed to ensure that there's accountability through an investigation from the ethics commissioner to ensure compliance, and ultimately public criticism is the real answer. You know, I know the commissioner said maybe fines could be larger. I don't see fines being a particularly useful sanction in many respects. It's ultimately that public criticism and accountability that matters, and we've seen lots of it.
I think the interesting part there is, and there's a difference between the former ethics commissioner who is of the same mindset as you, who espoused that exact view on the show last night, and the current one, Mario Dion, who does say that the office needs more teeth. I think the idea that he's been getting at is around deterrence. And in this case, for example, I'm sure you're familiar, like everybody else, that this is the third such ethics investigation into the Prime Minister. So it would appear that the punishments levied, or whatever the consequence was, didn't exactly act as deterrence.
Well, we currently have a maximum $500 fine, and I'd be curious what the current commissioner would propose as a solution to that, because I don't think a $1,000 fine or a $10,000 fine is near the deterrence value that public criticism ultimately holds. And I think that has to be the most important aspect of our conflict of interest regime, absent really intentional wrongdoing, right? Where there's really intentional wrongdoing, then the criminal law plays a really important role. But where we see an honest mistake, where we see a matter where someone ought to have recused himself and made a mistake in not doing so, I think a contrite apology, I think serious public criticism, as we've seen, is warranted. And I don't think we are going to see these kinds of mistakes going forward. And if anything, I think the call ought to be to ensure in the Prime Minister's office that they are ensuring that there are mechanisms in place and compliance mechanisms in place to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again.
Shouldn't those mechanisms, I guess, kind of be the staff? Shouldn't it be the Prime Minister himself?
Ultimately, I think there should be, in the case of a boardroom, you've got a compliance officer, and I think the same should be employed in the Prime Minister's office. And they need to take a hard look at their own office and see whether those mechanisms are sufficient. And we'll also let the Commissioner's investigation run its course, and he'll obviously issue a report, and there will be additional call potentially for public criticism, or we'll simply learn the same facts that we know today.
Okay, I do want to ask you, as I mentioned off the top, about a subject that we have spoken about many times, and that's the idea of decriminalization. And in particular, I want to ask you about something that came to light last week. The Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police decided to make an official call on the government to decriminalize the possession of small amounts of drugs for personal consumption. I know that you introduced this as a policy measure at a 2018 policy convention. It was very much supported at the time. I remember at the time asking the health minister, hey, is this something that you're going to move forward on or consider? I got a flat no. Do you think having police support that endeavor changes the potential for there to be political will behind it?
I think so. This problem has not been one of evidence. The evidence is overwhelming that treating drug use as a health issue will save lives, and that the status quo, punishing the very people we want to help, is completely ineffective. And so to have the police chiefs across this country stand at the microphone and say, the war on drugs has failed, that we need to deploy our resources to tackle the traffickers and the producers, that we can be doing a better job in addressing drug use as a health issue, I think matters a great deal to address those politics. I introduced 2 bills near the beginning of this parliament, pre-pandemic, to call for more sensible drug policy and to move us towards a public health approach. And in the wake of introducing those bills, there was a really nasty and fear-mongering, full of misinformation press release from my Conservative colleagues. And it's interesting that they did not issue a similar release when the police chiefs called for the exact same thing that I had called for. And so I think it absolutely does change the politics. And when we see public health experts have called for this for a very long time, now we see the police chiefs call for it. It's ultimately now up to the politicians.
I wonder also what you think about the pandemic in all of this. And I ask that because one of the sort of side effects of everything that's gone on with quarantine, with self-isolation, with shutting down so many businesses and places for people to stay is we've seen a remarkable increase in the number of overdoses right across this country, like a remarkable increase. In some provinces, more people are dying from overdoses than they have from COVID-19. And I wonder if you think that should also be part of what informs the government and their level of political will for this going forward.
Without question, we've listened to our public health experts in the course of this pandemic. Why don't we listen to our public health experts when they call for action on the opioid crisis, which in the case of BC killed more people in the month of May than all of the lives that BC has lost in the course of the pandemic and COVID-19. So absolutely, we need action on this. Absolutely, we need to follow the advice of public health experts. And the police chiefs have called for a national task force to make recommendations on what decriminalization could look like. They've noted that it could take any number of iterations. But in the short term, I think that we need Minister Hajdu and Minister Lametti to take a very serious look at the rules under the exemptions that Patty specifically could make under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, and where we see a request from Bonnie Henry over a year ago, when we see Premier Horgan at the microphone saying he welcomes the call. If there is local support for decriminalization, I firmly believe that in the short term, we can have the minister take action, issue an exemption, and effectively decriminalize in the jurisdictions that have called for it as a matter of local politics.
Okay, I'll leave it there. I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Erskine Smith. Pleasure to have you with us again.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.